this tutorial I'm going to show you Cubase Pro 9's new sampler track, and I'm going to show you a bunch of sounds that I made recorded using a sample of my voice that I recorded a little bit earlier. I'm just going to play the sample that I recorded first, and then I'm going to show you how I made these sounds that you can see in the channels below. This is the sampler track. So as you can hear from that, it's a pretty basic, just a vocal phrase that I've recorded myself, just to demonstrate the sampler track. If you're not familiar with the latest iteration of Cubase, you might have noticed that there's a little window at the bottom of the screen. This is now where the mix console sits, and it houses a MIDI editor. If I click on a MIDI track here, you can see the MIDI notes that have been programmed in for that. And it also does this thing called sample control, which is the new sample track that has been added into Cubase Pro 9. This is something that they've needed to put in for a long time, and obviously they have their own instrument which is called Hallion, which is a sort of sampler that you would probably use in place of Contact if you didn't want to use that. It's about the same price as well. This sampler is considerably lighter on the amount of features that it has, but that doesn't mean that it's not a really strong tool that you can use for shaping sounds. So I'm just going to show you quickly how to load a sample into a sampler track. As you can see, there's a large arrow that says drop audio sample here. It's pretty clear. If I just grab this vocal sample and drag it down here, what it's done is it's created a new sampler track. I'm just going to unmute that. I'm going to mute this. So this is the sampler track with my vocal channel playing in it. If I just hit a note on the keyboard, you should be able to hear how it sounds. This is the sampler track. And if I play it across the keyboard, you can hear the pitch change. This. So it runs just like a normal sampler would. If you're familiar with Ableton, the sampler runs very similar to that, and you've got a bunch of settings and features on it that you can use to manipulate the sound. You've got a pitch control here, which just controls the note. So if you were to program in, say if I play this C3 note, and then I use this, I can control it manually like this. But as I've got a MIDI keyboard right in front of me, I can just play across the keyboard and it's going to do the same thing. So that's quite cool. Another feature is the filter, which, as you'd expect, is just a range of different filters that you can use. There's a low pass 24 dB per octave low pass filter that's already set as default, but it's actually got quite a few different ones that you can use. There's a high pass and a low pass, which kind of works like a band pass. You've also got a band reject, which works like a notch filter. And these are all different types of filters, so the higher the number tends to be the tighter the Q curve. And it's quite fun for playing around with and testing these. In addition to the shapes of the filters, you've got different types. So there's a sort of classic sound, there's a tube sound that's the default. This rate and bit red, not quite sure what rate KF stands for, but it creates some quite interesting sounds, and I've used it in some of the sounds in the sampler track, which I'll show you in a second. And you've got standard sort of filter controls on this. You've got your cutoff, your reso, which is short for resonance, and you've got an overdrive panel there. And then obviously you've got your amplification control. Audio warp is a feature that's been part of Cubase for a long time. It's used mainly in audio samples, and they've added this into the sample feature, and you can just use it to change the speed of the sample, which kind of in a way changes the pitch, but it's good for if you say, for example, you've got a very quick sample, you could change the speed of it so it drags the length of the sample out, and it can create some quite interesting effects. It works similar to a pitch, but not the same. It's hard to sort of describe. The best thing to do is to just sort of have a play with it. Again, this is something that I've used in the sample tracks. So I've just created a bunch of sounds. I'm just going to delete this track because I'm not going to need it for the rest of this tutorial. I've made a bunch of these sampler tracks, and I'm just going to hide this bottom panel for the time being. To do that, you just click on the show or hide lower zone, which is Command Option and E as a shortcut. So I've hidden that, and first sound that I've made is a kick drum sound. And all of these sounds have been made using that original vocal sample that I recorded earlier talking about the sampler track. So that's a pretty basic kick sound. How did I make it? If I click on the panel, the bottom panel again, and let's pull it up. So I've clicked on the channel, and that's how you pull up the settings. It's not like an instrument track where you'd find the keyboard, which is just there. You do have to pull up this bottom bar. So let's just run through the settings that I've used to create this kick drum sound. So as you can see, that file is called Audio 01. That's the file that's used in this top part here. And if I just click on this little guy, you should be able to see that this is, it's quite hard to tell where I've got this from, because it doesn't look anything like the waveform that's at the top, and the reason why that is because I've used a different loop mode. So if I just go to no loop, and you should then see the original waveform, and what I've done is I've used the start and end times of the sample to select the very first vocal phrase, and I've changed the loop mode to continuous, so I can just loop that one section. And you can see here this little green guy is just the overlap, so when I play it, it's looping this middle section over and over. This kind of technique is used a lot for bass sounds in sampling. If you've got a very short sample, you can use that, and I did use that for the bass sample, so I'll go into a little bit more detail later on. But for this instance, I'm going to hit play again. It's really just sort of playing through that sample once or twice, and then it's reversing. So how does it sound so different to the original vocal? I've used a filter. As you can see, it's got quite a low cut off. It's hitting down at about 85 Hertz, which is kind of roughly just under where you'd want to boost on most normal kicks. But it's got loads of drive on it, and the pitch has been brought down quite considerably as well. It's just under an octave. It's been brought down. What I have made use of in this is the envelopes that the filters all have, and to access these, you just click on these little filter envelope icons, and as you can see, there's one for each different way of processing the sample. So there's one for the amplitude, there's one for the filter, and there's one for the pitch. In this instance, I've used, let's make this a little bit bigger. I've used one for the pitch. So this is the amount of pitch that's going to change with the filter. I've got it starting really high and shoot down just like any kind of transient would on a drum hit. And if you've seen any of my other tutorials on drum design, you will have seen, you know, very similar sort of envelopes in place. With the filter, I've done a very similar thing. This is just so that you get a little click at the top and the cutoff goes right back down, and the release of the kick sound is just a pure bottom end sound. There's no top end. So that's my kick sound, and let's just show you how it would sound if I took the cutoff up. So it's kind of a bass sound really. It's not really a kick by any means, but with that filter and with that really short attack, it sounds more like a dull hit, which is obviously what a kick drum would sound like. Have I used anything else? I've used the amplitude envelope just to shape the shape of the kick a little bit more. So it's got a very short decay, and it's got a tiny bit of sustain with a decent amount of release on it, and what that does is it just gives it a more natural tail. And you can hear I'm playing it across the keyboard there. So yeah, that's the kick drum sound, and as you can see in this instance, I've put it in a 4/4 pattern, nothing too special. I've made a little percussive sound. This came from the kick drum, so it's very similar. It's not been used in a loop. Let's just come out of this envelope. So it's playing the sample pretty much as it is. And what I've done is I've used the audio warp setting. You might have noticed on the left hand side that I've used quite a considerable amount of audio inserts. If I just bypass those for a second, you can hear. Let's play the sound first. So I'm going to play the sound, and you can hear it as it sounds with all of the effects on. So I've got a Pro Q1 here. Originally this was going to be a kick drum sound, so I've kind of shaped it. So I've cut out all of this like muddy area and boosted the sort of 100 hertz area. I put a multi-band envelope shaper on it. Obviously at some point I decided that the release of the sound was a bit too much, so I've tried to rein it in a little bit. And I've used an instance of Valhalla Room. At some point when I decided this was going to be a percussion sound, I've just added a tiny bit of reverb on here. And I've got a Camel Crusher just to work really as a limiter more than anything else. It's distorting it a tiny bit, it's compressing it a tiny bit, but what it's doing is it's catching any peaks, because I don't want to create loads of distortion on this. So if I just play it as the insert's bypassed, and you can hear that there's not really that much difference to it. The reverb itself is doing the bulk of the work, and the EQ's just taking out some of the nastier frequencies. This would work really well as a top layer for a kick drum, for example. And with this kick, you could get quite a cool kick drum sound, and that's just from the vocal sample of my voice that I've done that. I've made a kind of percussive blippy sound. I'm just going to play you that. And this is another one that's a looped part of the first sample. I would say that this was just a variation of the bass sound, and I've obviously played it a lot higher up the keyboard. So if I just go back to the kick and take this off, so you can see I've used the same loop settings there, and it's got very similar filter settings, but the pitch is a lot higher. And that's really it. There's a delay on it, just a tiny bit of delay, and I'm using stock plugin delays here. I use this one all the time. It's really good, and there's not too many controls on it to fiddle around with. So I'll just play it one more time. So yeah, there's that, and onto the bass. So this is the sound that's probably the most similar to the kick drum sound, but I've made it run a little bit longer. So this is the amplitude envelope. It's got more sustain, so if I hold a key, it's gonna keep hold of it. There's a couple of effects. I'm gonna play it first, and then I'll run through how I came about getting this sound. So it's kind of quite a typical dubstep bass sort of sound. There's a rising filter that just makes use of the low pass cutoff in the sample, and I've got a touch of EQ just to boost the sub frequencies and just cut out some of the frequencies where the kick would sit. It's kind of like a first port of call where I go to with EQs for bass sounds, and then sort of work around it and see what suits the sound itself. I've got another Camel Crusher, just doing a touch of distortion and a touch of compression, mainly just to flatten out the sound, and then a little bit of the Valhalla Room reverb because it just sounds really good. So this is what it sounds like without it. So it's definitely a lot less vibe to the sound without those additional sounds. And I've used the until release setting on the loop mode again. If we just go out of here to the sample itself and zoom in, you can see that I've used the very first part of the vocal sample. So if I just zoom out, I'll make this a little bit longer and you should be able to hear. So I've used quite a low version of this.
This is the sampler track.
This is the sampler track. I've used the audio warp setting to change the BPM, and what that's actually doing is it's making it faster. But in this instance, with the loop setting, If I just go back to it and set it back to until release, and this is one of the things that took me a little while to work out with the sampler, so this might be something to take note of, that when you change through the loop modes, while it's in no loop, you can change the sample end and start time, and I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, but once you've actually set a loop up, you can't change that, so that took me ages to work out. Probably some of you might have already worked this out, but if I go back to until the release and zoom back in on that first section, it's kind of creating almost like a sort of like an oscillator that played really low down the keyboard. Doesn't sound too different from some of the stock waveforms that you would get in Massive, for example. Okay, on to the next sound, and that's the shake sound that I made, and it's in a really basic pattern here, just an off. It's not very loud. I'm just going to pull it up a touch. And the section of this audio sample that I've used for this part is just the second bit. If I just go back to play the original sample, so I'll turn the shaker off. So what I've done is I've used that last part of the word this. So I'm using just this sort of sound in my voice, and I've used a high pass filter to cut out all the bottom end, and that's basically the shaker sound. And I've muted it so you can't hear it, which is stupid. That's the shaker sound. Really easy to do, and it's quite interesting. There's such a variety of sounds that I've made using just a vocal sample and the sampler track. I think it's a really powerful tool, and you can create some really cool sounds with even some of the simplest of sounds. Just to elaborate on the shake sound that I made, I've made a closed hi-hat sort of sound, and what I've done here is, instead of capturing the first sort of slow attack of the shaker, if you look here, it's starting right here, so it's got a slower sort of sound. Here I'm using right in the middle of it, so it's got like a straight away it hits. I'll just play that so you can hear it. It's a lot sharper, it's a lot tighter, more like a closed hi-hat would be. And in conjunction with the shake, you can hear they both sound different. You can hear the difference in the two while it's playing. They've both got similar cut-off filter settings, and the amplitude envelope set really short just to keep that really snappy and tight. And the next track, I've made a very poor clap sound, and this time I used the bit reduction filter, so I'm just going to play that for you. So it's probably not a clap that you would use in all of your productions, but if you wanted something that sounded a little bit odd and strange, perhaps my voice isn't suited to creating clap samples, who knows. So this is, again, it's the S sort of sound from that this in the original sample. I've used the audio warp setting to it's speeding up the sample, but what it's actually doing is it's playing it slower, which is how I'm getting that kind of weird movement in there. And then the bit reduction is doing quite a lot of the sort of strangeness. If I take the filter off, you can hear that pretty much it's the bit crushing in the filter that's creating that kind of clappy sound. I've got a reverb on there. Take that off. That's helping me just sort of get a little bit closer to a clap sound. It's not the greatest sound, I'll be honest. And I've made a kind of vocal lead sounds. I think this sounds a little bit like the sort of thing Arca would make. So I've used all of the sample. It's kicking off at the start. So most of these samples actually pretty much just use the first part of the sample, just this one word. Basically didn't even need to use any of the rest of it, but I could probably get some other sounds with those parts. I've used the audio warp. I'm going to turn all of the sounds off so you can kind of hear what the audio warp is doing. I hope anyway. So, and with the filter, it's taking away some of that time stretchy top end that you can hear in it. And then with this Valhalla room, which I've used, they're all the same setting. I'm just using different mix ratios here. And here's what it would sound like without the audio warp in it. So because it's playing the notes high up the keyboard, it's playing the sample a lot faster. And by using the audio warp, I can slow down the speed that the sample plays at considerably. So when I play it higher up the keyboard, it doesn't sound too quick. So for example, now it sounds more natural. It sounds like it should be played at that octave. And finally, I've just got a kind of a low drony sound. This is actually just a variation of that vocal lead sound. It's got similar audio warp settings. It's got similar filter settings. It's got a reverb on it, probably the same as the last one, and it's got a little bit of a delay on it, so I'm just going to play it for you. And what's going on with this is I'm playing it a few octaves lower than I was playing the vocal lead sound. If I just play, yeah, you can hear by playing it a few octaves up that it's basically the same sound as the lead sound. So that really quickly was the sampler track in Cubase Pro 9. I've been District. Thanks a lot.